Breaking news, President Trump does a 180 on foreign policy. This is CNN Tonight. I'm Don Lemon. For those keeping score at home, we're now on the outs with Russia. China is no longer a currency manipulator, and NATO isn't obsolete after all. What's behind the president's about face on all of this? Plus, the man who said this to Kellyanne Conway.
When they say democracy dies in darkness, you're the darkness.
And are Steve Bannon's days in the White House numbered? It's just day 83, by the way. Going up against the boss's family is not exactly a guarantee of job security. And when that boss, President of the United States, says, quote, "I like Steve, but it could be time to dust off your resume." But let's get right to CNN Sarah Murray at the White House for us live this evening. Sarah, good evening to you. President Trump is doing a 180 today on several key foreign policy positions on the U.S. relationship with Russia, on Syria, on NATO, on China's currency. What's with all the U-turns here?
There were a lot of changes. He was going to label China a currency manipulator on day one. Now he is not so keen to do that. NATO was obsolete when Donald Trump was a candidate, but now that he is a president, less than 100 days into his presidency, NATO is not so obsolete. Today, Jim Acosta, our colleague, of course, here at CNN, caught up with Sean Spicer, and Spicer basically said circumstances change. Things have changed now that Donald Trump is president. But, Don, what you can bet is things change once you have the perspective of being in this White House, of being in this West Wing. And Donald Trump is learning firsthand, yeah, China is making some changes to its own currency policies, to its own trade policies. They believe that China is beginning to change its ways, but also that they can strike a deal with China, particularly when it comes to dealing with North Korea. And when you're facing NATO, they were saying, yeah, countries are making some changes to try to increase their defense spending, but they're also realizing that NATO is a powerful ally when you're trying to confront Russia, particularly in the face of what's happened in Syria and the president ordering strikes there. So I think you're seeing an evolving view of a president who's getting a sense of what the world looks like when you are sitting in that Oval Office.
That's very interesting, and interestingly enough, Sarah, this is all coming on the same day that President Trump is speaking out on Steve Bannon and essentially putting him on notice. What's up with that?
Today, Donald Trump described Steve Bannon, his chief strategist in this White House, to the Wall Street Journal as a guy who works for me. A guy who works for me, not his chief strategist. So clearly this is someone who is on thin ice. Our sense so far is that Bannon is not getting the boot from this White House, but he certainly has had his wrist slapped. He's been put on notice. And many people are saying to us, many sources, that now the ball is in Steve Bannon's court. It's up to him whether he decides to stay, whether he decides to play nice with folks in this White House. But one source told me that what really irked the president is the notion, the analysis that the president is here enacting Steve Bannon's agenda and not the reverse, that it's the president's agenda that Steve Bannon is carrying out. Remember, this is a White House where it's basically the Hunger Games day to day. People rise, people fall in favor, people have constantly had the knives out for one another. So it'll be interesting to see how Bannon handles this. He is not someone who has really come in the crosshairs the way we've seen some other staffers. And, you know, he could choose to leave at any moment, although right now sources say he's kind of digging in, he's preparing for the fight. He wants to lay low and try to maintain his hold in this White House. We will see if that works.
Shall see. You took the words right out of my mouth. We shall see. Palace intrigue, to say the least. Thank you, Sarah. Appreciate that. Yeah. I want to bring in now CNN Global Affairs analyst Tony Blinken, who was Deputy National Security Advisor to President Obama, and Admiral James Woolsey, the former director of the Central Intelligence Agency. Good evening, gentlemen. Thank you so much for coming on. Tony, I'm going to start with you. So let's go through some of these 180s. Here's what President Trump said on NATO. This is during the campaign, and what he said today. Listen to this.
Do you think the United States needs to rethink U.S. involvement in NATO?
Yes, because it's costing us too much money.
Number one, NATO is obsolete. Number two, the countries in NATO are not paying their fair share.
It's obsolete, and we pay too much money.
NATO is obsolete. In my opinion, NATO is obsolete.
And here's the problem with NATO. It's obsolete.
It was 67 years, or it's over 60 years old.
When I said that NATO to Wolf Blitzer is obsolete, I got attacked. 3 days later, people that study NATO said, you know, Trump is right. I said it was obsolete. It's no longer obsolete.
So, Tony, what do you think changed for the president?
Apparently, the president fixed NATO in the couple of months he's been in office. No, look, in fairness, Don, a couple of things. One, any president coming in confronts a barrier, and that barrier is called reality. And often the positions they take during a campaign just run right into that barrier, and so they change and they adjust and they adapt. And if that's what's happening, that's a good thing. I think what's unusual about President Trump is the vigor with which he takes on a new position as if he'd never held the old one, and counting a little bit on our collective amnesia to forget that he said something diametrically opposed to what he's saying now. But if the end result is a policy and an approach that better reflects reality and better reflects our interests around the world, that's a good thing.
Well, look, listen, Tony, no president knows what it's like until you sit in the Oval Office. So is it that much different than any previous president that you can remember?
Well, I think it's different in the sense that, first, we've just seen so many whiplash moments in the last, 48 hours or a few days. You went through the litany of changes in a very short period of time. That creates a sense of whiplash. And again, it's also the fact that he simply doesn't acknowledge that he held a diametrically opposite view just a few days or a few weeks or a few months ago. Yeah. That's what's causing this, I think, moment of confusion.
But when you look at the political part of it, you know, if you're a pundit and if you're paying close attention, you would say, is this a man who would say anything to get into office, Tony?
Well, it's definitely an extreme version of that. No politician is immune to that. I think the president arguably has taken it to a new level. But, Don, here's what concerns me. We're seeing this whiplash. That's one thing. But we're also seeing that he is now trying to rally the world against the misinformation campaign that Russia and Assad are running on the use of chemical weapons in Syria. And that puts a premium on credibility. People need to believe the American president. And yet one thing that hasn't changed, even as his policies apparently have, is that he continues to put out on a daily basis through his tweets false information, wrong facts, misinformation, conspiracy theories of one kind or another that undermine the credibility that is one of his most valuable weapons in bringing the world together when faced with a threat like chemical weapons in Syria.
Mm-hmm. Ambassador Woolsey, to you now. Of course, President Trump's changing position on Syria following the chemical attack there. Here's what the president said on Assad. This was back in 2015 and then today.
So I've watched Assad, and I've watched a little bit on the other side. The problem is the other side of Assad, we have no idea who they are. They probably are racist. I'm saying, are we better off with Assad? We have no idea who these people are. We give them weapons, we give them ammunition, we give them everything. Aaron, we have no idea who, I mean, maybe it's worse than Assad. So what are we doing? Why are we involved? Young children dying, babies dying, fathers holding children in their arms that were dead children. There can't be a worse sight, and it shouldn't be allowed. That's a butcher. That's a butcher. So I felt we had to do something about it.
So, Ambassador, if you're just watching this at home objectively, you would say this person doesn't know what he's talking about.
No, I don't think I would say that. Consistency is not the objective in foreign policy. You're going to be making adjustments and changes.
No, I'm talking about when he's campaigning, because he said completely different things when he's campaigning, and then once he got into the White House, there was a different reality, and now he knows what's happening. But during the campaign, he said completely opposite. And if you know what you're talking about, then it shouldn't be different once you get behind that desk.
Well, he said that NATO, for example, was obsolete. Read in its current form, but he has proposed some changes to it, the allocation of funds and so forth. So he didn't say it was obsolete and could not be fixed. And so I think you want to stay away from assuming that each statement is embedded in concrete. Consistency is not what you're after in foreign policy. You have to maintain to it some degree, but you know, we had most of the United States hated Joseph Stalin in 1940, but we sure had to shift gears in 1941 when he became our close ally against Hitler. These things are the essence of security and foreign policy decision making, and sometimes they change because of politics. Sometimes they change because a a leader learns something and changes his mind. It happened to Bill Clinton on dealing with Kosovo. He earlier had stayed away from using force to save the Rwandans, and then nearly a million Rwandans were killed. And so Bill Clinton thought about that and decided that the next time something like that came up, he was going to use force, and he did in Kosovo, and it was well done. Presidents get to change their minds, I think.
Okay. Well, Tony, to that point then, and my last response and his, let's listen to what the president's take on Russia then and now.
I think I'd get along very well with Vladimir Putin. I just think so.
Putin says very nice things about me. I think that's very nice.
I got to know him very well because we were both on 60 Minutes. We were stablemates, and we did very well that night. Right now, we're not getting along with Russia at all. We may be at an all-time low in terms of relationship with Russia.
Well, that didn't take long, did it, Tony?
Look, it's hard to ignore two things. First, it was impossible for the president to ignore this horrific chemical weapons attack in Syria and Russia's complicity in that attack, either by not enforcing the agreement that it brokered in 2013 to stop the regime in Syria from using chemical weapons, or perhaps even being directly complicit in the attack itself. So having acted rightly, in my judgment, in response to that, to the use of chemical weapons, the president couldn't ignore Russia's role in it. The other thing that I think it's increasingly difficult for him to ignore is that in place after place around the world, Russia is making real mischief against our interests, whether it's in Libya, whether it's in Afghanistan, whether it's in Ukraine, or whether it's in Syria. And so here's another reality moment confronting the president. Now, he still has resisted any effort to get him to speak about Putin himself and to condemn Putin's leadership. But you're hearing that from all of his lieutenants, and I think he's confronting the reality that Russia is acting in ways inimical to our interests in many places around the world.
So, Ambassador, let's talk about China. He's saying that China was a currency manipulator, and now they're not a currency manipulator. What do you think?
Well, they may well not have changed very much in those few days. But manipulation is a matter of degree, and if you have a foreign policy reason to emphasize that you're starting to get along with China, they voted to abstain rather than to veto, for example, on the UN resolution on Syria. If you start to see some positive steps, you can take a positive step without repudiating what you've said or done before. You don't have to stay cleaved to the adjectives that you used the first time through. You can make some adjustments.
All right, Ambassador Tony, thank you very much. I appreciate that. And we come right back. Will all of these changes in policy alienate the president's strongest supporters? Stunning U-turns from President Trump on some of the biggest foreign policy issues. Let's discuss now. CNN political analyst David Gregory is here, political commentator David Swerdlick, political director David Chalian, and political analyst Rebecca Berg. I could have just said a bunch of Davids and, you know, a rose among thorns. So bear with me. I had a little dental thing today, so my mouth is a little swollen. So let's try to get through this in case you notice at home. So you first, David Gregory. We just heard all the president's flip-flops. Russia, NATO, China, on Assad, all changing positions. And this is what he tweeted earlier. He said, one by one, we are keeping our promises on the border, on energy, on jobs, on regulations. Big changes are happening. He's reacting, sounds like, some of the news coverage, no?
I think he probably is. You know, I think there's two things that I think go on in his mind. And that is, one, that this is all the art of negotiation. And that if he pulls back, say, on China, on currency manipulation, well, he's got a bigger goal in mind, and that is that he wants to get help on North Korea. And so he's being flexible. He wants to be unpredictable as well to our allies and to our enemies, to scare them, to have them think, geez, you know, what is he capable of? Who knows? I think he looks at these things together and sees the making of a more unconventional foreign and national security policy that can be effective. And he's flipping in a way that a lot of people don't object to. They think, oh, well, he's moderating. That's a good thing.
But are we being too analytical here? And, was there a strategy, or is it he just didn't know until he became president? He said what got him elected.
Yeah.
He appealed to his base, and then once he got into the White House, which many people said, you're never going to be able to accomplish that, and then he said, oh, well, I just changed my position on it.
I think in some cases he simply didn't know. Yeah. In other cases, I think it's situational awareness. This happens in Syria.
Right.
And he does have people around him who are pulling him in a direction that reflects more establishment thinking. Syria is a good example of that, with the influence of a Tillerson, of a Mattis, H.R. McMaster. Those are things that you should want in terms of a maturation process from a candidate with no experience to becoming the commander-in-chief.
David Chalia, now on China, we got some insight into President Trump and his conversation with the Chinese president in the Wall Street Journal today. And Mr. Trump said that Mr. Trump said he told his Chinese counterpart he believed Beijing could easily take care of North Korea, the North Korea threat. Mr. Xi then explained the history of China and Korea. Mr. Trump said, after listening for 10 minutes, I realized it's not so easy. Mr. Trump recounted, I felt pretty strongly that they had a tremendous power over North Korea, he said, but it's not what he would think. So, I mean...
It reminds us of his words on health care. Who knew it was this complicated?
Who knew? And on a more serious note, though, when you look at what happened in Syria, those horrible pictures have been coming out of Syria for, 7 years now, and he just happened to see them? I mean, many people say he did the right thing, but still... He just became aware of these things?
Well, no. Again, I think seeing them outside of being president of the United States and seeing those kinds of images while sitting in the Oval Office is a different experience, no doubt. I do think we are watching somebody learn on the job. I think that's true for most presidents. There is no comparable position. So I do think in that sense, it's not terribly unusual. What is a little bit unusual is just because Trump doesn't seem to have real ideological moorings, a real philosophical grounding in sort of a vision for foreign policy. I think that we know that Donald Trump is a pretty flexible person, Don, and so I think he's even more flexible in this area because there is no real guiding principle, and I think that's what we're seeing unfold.
Mm-hmm. David Swerdlick, the Russia investigation now heating up once again. Ex-campaign manager, campaign chairman, I should say, Paul Manafort, expected to register as a foreign agent. The AP is reporting that he was paid millions of dollars off the books from a pro-Russian entity, and that was years before the campaign. Manafort says nothing was improper. Here's what President Trump's longtime friend, Tom Barrack, someone who helped introduce Manafort to the campaign, had to say about this.
I've known Paul for over 30 years. He's credible. He's reliable. He's an unbelievable pro. I've found his character to be bulletproof.
Do you think Manafort was compromised or colluding with the Russians to try to rig this election for Donald Trump in any way?
Look, in my personal opinion, it's heresy. It's impossible. Number one, the president-elect had no inclination of Russia. It wasn't on his radar. It had no purpose in domestic policy. Number two, Paul Manafort's job, who's working for free, by the way, was singularly a domestic convention which relied on such grassroots politics that Russia, the Ukraine, had no place on the stage. So I don't know the facts. I'm just saying I know the man, I know the character of the man, I know what happened during that election, I know what happened during the convention, and I would have a hard time believing it.
Does it surprise you, David Swerdlick, that Barrack is still vouching for him?
Well, it doesn't surprise me. I mean, he knows these individuals, and he is a supporter of Trump and the Trump administration, and he said he doesn't know all the facts. I think the trouble with the answers that the Trump camp, that President Trump and his associates have given up to this point, is that it still doesn't answer, Don, the big picture question. Let's just say, for argument's sake, that everything that Paul Manafort did was legal and above board. He registers as a lobbyist. He's getting paid by the Yanukovych administration. Look, people make a living. Lots of Americans work for foreign governments or lobby for foreign governments. Same goes for Carter Page giving a speech in Russia last year arguing against the U.S. sanctions. But the question for the Trump administration is, if those guys, if they were following the law, et cetera, why are those the guys in the inner orbit of the Trump campaign and potentially advising a future President Trump on foreign policy vis-a-vis Russia, which is a U.S. adversary under which we have sanctioned them since 2014. And why during all this time was there so much smoke about from the mouth of President Trump himself about getting along with Russia, talking down NATO, talking up the possibility of rapprochement with Russia. It's all smoke, but they still really have not satisfactorily answered that.
That's a good question. I was just pose that to Rebecca and say what he said, but let me add that just on top of that, it's not just Paul Manafort. You also have the Washington Post reporting that the FBI was monitoring ex-Trump advisor Carter Page for acting as an agent for Russia. Carter Page said he wasn't. So, Rebecca, did President Trump just surround himself with dodgy people? What's going on here?
I mean, that's completely a possible explanation here, Don. And so you wonder, Donald Trump has said that Carter Page, for example, was not a top aide. He wasn't close to the campaign. You have Sean Spicer going out there and saying Paul Manafort was nothing more than a volunteer for the campaign and not an important player, even at the same time he was campaign manager. So you have to wonder, how influential were these people in this circle? You would think Paul Manafort had a great deal of influence and trust in the Trump organization. Carter Page, maybe not as influential, but then you had Donald Trump mentioning his name second in a list of his foreign policy advisors in an interview with the Washington Post editorial board over the summer. And so you have to wonder why these inconsistencies with their stories. But certainly they had some influence in the campaign, and it does go back to the judgment of the chief executive, of the candidate and now the president. Why did he pick these people to work for him? We haven't really had a good explanation from Donald Trump or any of his top advisors as to what qualities he thought were good in these people and why maybe he misjudged them. The same can go for General Flynn, who of course had to resign from this administration because he lied to the vice president, perhaps lied to the president himself. We don't have those answers yet.
All we've had
Don,
is
can we
Carter.
just correct the record on one thing Tom Barrack said there? I just want to correct the record on one thing in that clip of Tom Barrack. To say that Paul Manafort, who was running the convention, was dealing with grassroots politics and Russia was nowhere near his mind. I just want to remind everyone that there was a platform battle inside the RNC during the convention that Manafort was managing that was a soft on Russia plank that he was responsible for getting inserted into the Republican Party platform. So let's not say
they said that was coincidental. It had nothing to do with it. But, so far, all we've heard is Paul who? Carter who? Well, no, those guys. Okay. Stand by, everyone. When we come right back, President Trump publicly undercutting one of his top aides. Is White House in a major shakeup right now? Is a shakeup coming to President Trump's inner circle? The signs are not good tonight for Chief Strategist Steve Bannon. Back now with my panel. I'm not sure if you agree with that, David Gregory. I mean, let's talk some more about Steve Bannon. Is he on the way out?
Well, it's not clear to me that he's on the way out, but he's certainly being marginalized.
Is he at the kids' table?
Right. Well, functionally, look, I think the downside of getting rid of Steve Bannon is that he's got a big constituency out there, a grassroots movement that is a big part of the conservative movement that Donald Trump was relying on and is trying to create with Steve Bannon's help. But I think the problem that Bannon had is he was getting bigger than the principal. Mm-hmm. He was getting too much attention, and frankly, he was responsible for policies that haven't gone so well, and they're making the president look bad. Any president doesn't like to look bad that way. This one, in particular, will not countenance anyone being bigger than him or getting more credit than Trump feels that he deserves. And I think that's been a problem. And, of course, if he's at odds with his son-in-law, that's not going to go well either. Jared Kushner has a very special place in this White House and in President Trump's mind. The contours of that are not, totally knowable. But I think he's a calming influence and certainly directs him in a lot of ways that Trump is very comfortable with. Other people are going to be more expendable.
At this moment, and who knows what happens in the future, when it comes to the base, Steve Bannon has way more influence.
Right, and I think that Trump has always had Bannon around to be a kind of keeper of the flame of that fringe element of the conservative movement that he can offer advice from and keep credibility with, because Trump relies on that as part of a leg of the stool of the movement that he's trying to create and that he was successful in creating to get to the White House.
But that part of the movement may not be helpful in making him a successful president.
Right, and they're already being problematic on on things
so
like the
many
Syria
issues, as you
strike,
said,
for
right.
example. Yeah.
So, in David Swerdlick, anytime you're saying, I like David Swerdlick, but, right, this is from the New York Post. I like Steve, speaking of Steve Bannon, this is what he said, I like Steve, but you have to remember, he was not involved in my campaign until very late. I had already beaten all the senators and all the governors, and I didn't know Steve. I'm my own strategist, and it wasn't like I was going to change strategies because I was facing crooked Hillary. So it seems like a complete change in tune, really, for the president, almost as if he feels the need to remind everyone who the boss is.
It is a change in tune, Don. To David Gregory's point, I think this is an indicator not necessarily that Bannon is going to be dismissed anytime soon, but that Trump wants to take him down a peg or diminish the perception of his role in influencing policy in the White House. Donald Trump is loyal to Donald Trump. Donald Trump is the one who likes to make Donald Trump look good. And the other difference between these two men right now, in addition to the fact that Bannon is taking some of the blame for the rocky first 80 or going on 100 days of this administration, is that Donald Trump, even though he shoots from the hip, Don, even though he liked to rabble-rouse during the campaign, Donald Trump ultimately seeks the praise of the establishment. He wants to be seen as a good guy by all. Steve Bannon, on the other hand, relishes that role as an irritant. Even though Steve Bannon is wealthy, used to work for Goldman Sachs, went to Harvard, was in the Navy, he likes to be seen as someone who's an outsider, an irritant to the Washington class. And I think that those two sort of different positions are rubbing up against each other in a way that's not working for Bannon.
You make a very good point, because for those of us, for people who, have been around Donald Trump for a while, New Yorkers and people who've been thought, the establishment, he wants to be accepted. He wants to be accepted by celebrities. He understands that the New York Times and the Washington Post and CNN are American brands, and he wants to be loved by those brands. But the people in the middle of the country don't get that. That's why he talks about CNN so much and about the New York Times, is because
and
that's
I
the
think he
institution he
gets
comes
wrong.
from.
Look, Bannon, what did he say, that the press needs to shut up or shut its mouth and look up?
That was Bannon.
That was Bannon, right. But and talked about the press as an opposition. In some ways you could see the influence on Trump when he went off on his tangents going after the press. But look how many interviews the guy does. I mean, he is both transparent and wants that acceptance. He wants to be legitimate now, especially as president.
How much do you think, Rebecca, he's bothered by those headlines and the SNL skit and all of that with, Bannon as the real president?
It's clear that he's hugely bothered, Don. I mean, look at the statements he made about Bannon in the Post and the Wall Street Journal. Not only did he dismiss him as just some guy in his administration while he's the chief strategist and his former campaign chief strategist as well, but he also said in both of these interviews, I am my own strategist, not anyone else. And of course, the implication being that Steve Bannon is not the one behind the curtain making all of this happen for Donald Trump. And so you wonder, has he seen the President Bannon headlines, or has he seen the SNL skit? Whether he has or not, clearly he is irked by this suggestion that Steve Bannon is running the show and really the wizard behind the curtain, as opposed to Donald Trump being the one in charge here,
I know,
running
and
this
then
White
him
House.
at the small desk. I saw one of those toys in the toy store the other day, too. I almost bought it. So listen, David, I have to ask you this, David Schein, because I don't know if you saw this in the Washington Post, fascinating this evening. There's a story in there. And here's, according to sources, it says, Trump's three oldest children, Donald Jr., Ivanka, and Eric, and Kushner, have been frustrated by the impression of chaos inside the White House. The Trump heirs are interested in any changes that might help resuscitate the presidency and preserve the family's name at a time when they are trying to expand the Trump organization's portfolio of hotels. That's pretty frightening, because, listen, a possible ousting of Bannon and preserving the Trump brand, I mean, and correct me if I'm wrong here, the sons are supposed to be removed entirely from the political process.
Well, they've said they've removed themselves from the administration, but I don't think it is beyond reason to think that they are concerned with their father's political health as it impacts the Trump brand. I would be too if I were in their shoes. And, David Gregory was talking before about the keeper of the flame and how Bannon could sort of be that role for Donald Trump. Really, there's no bigger flame to keep than the Trump brand. That is the most important thing to the entire family, including Donald Trump.
For Trump, you mean, not for the American people.
Correct. No. I do mean for Trump. I am speaking from his perspective. As important as it is to make sure the base of the Bannon base, if you will, stays on board and is enthusiastic about his presidency, I don't think anything matters to the president more than the Trump brand.
All right. Thank you all. Great panel.
Thanks,
See you
John.
soon.
Thank you, John.
When we come back, I'll speak to the man who said this to Kellyanne Conway.
When they say democracy dies in darkness, you're the darkness.
Conway's response. Can you believe that? I know, right? Next. White House advisor Kellyanne Conway went toe-to-toe today with my next guest, and things got lively, as they always do, with Mr. Michael Wolff, the columnist for The Hollywood Reporter. Good evening, sir. Thank you for joining us, and he's in D.C. tonight because that's where the story is right now, he says. So, Michael, you interviewed Kellyanne Conway today at this forum about the press and the presidency, and you asked her about what the media thinks of the Trump administration, mentioning the Washington Post's new slogan, "Democracy dies in darkness." Let's play a moment, and then we'll discuss.
How personal do you take this?
How personally do I take what?
What the this coverage of you, democracy dies in darkness? Because I'm going to tell you, when they say democracy dies in darkness, you're the darkness.
I'm not the darkness.
You're no, and I don't.
Didn't you see this
I don't
yet,
mean
walking on
that's,
sunshine?
That's not.
You're saying that that's what it's meant to be, but
yeah, that's
again,
not,
it's what I tell small children. Just because somebody says something doesn't make it true, and it's a great lesson for everyone.
What did you make of her response, Michael?
You know, well, I think you know, it was funny because I was asking her if she took all of this criticism personally. And in answer, she responded, taking it very personally, and perhaps misunderstanding what I was trying to say. I mean, I was trying to say that, you know, the Washington Post, in the age of Trump, they've now given themselves a new tagline: "Democracy dies in darkness," which to me is ridiculous and preposterous and also pretty pretentious. And it also sends a clear signal. The Washington Post thinks the Trump administration represents darkness, which I would say is some form of bias. And that's what I was trying to...
You think they're being specific to this administration?
Yeah, well, come on. Yeah, you know, democracy dies in darkness. That's a tagline that you put on when Donald Trump becomes president. I would say, yeah. And so I asked Kellyanne about this, and then I think she reacted in a personal manner instead of saying, you know, this is another indication that the media is in every way, shape, and form stacked against this new administration.
Yeah, and listen, for those of us who were at the beginning of this, so Michael, I'm just being honest, it's not that surprising. I mean, Kellyanne often took things personally and didn't, instead of looking at them in an objective way to the question. I mean, that's not new for her, but it's surprising that having been in this role for such a while, I would say that she is still doing this. And I thought your question was very objective, and it wasn't, you know, there was a way to answer it without saying, no, I don't take it personally, but, you know, answer it in the way you did. I do think it's shameful or it's sad that they had to put that moniker on their newspaper.
Yeah, I think she could have answered it in many ways, but I do think one of the things that actually has made her effective as a spokesperson for the president, at least effective for a part of the electorate, is that she responds in this visceral manner.
I want to play some other things, so and we're losing time here, and it's my fault. I sort of meandered a little bit. You also asked her about the news being truthful, and take a listen to this.
Turn on the TV more than you can read in the paper, because I assume editors are still doing their jobs in most places. And people literally say things that just aren't true. They're not even disguised as opinion. Yeah.
The crowd laughed, presumably, because in February, Kamala cited a non-existent massacre as justification for the president's immigration ban. She also referred to alternative facts. I mean, do you think, does she have a credibility problem, and is she aware of it, if so?
Well, you know, the other day I was in a discussion actually on CNN, which I got a lot of blowback for, in which I said that the New York Times and the Trump administration are equally unreliable narrators. And I continue to think that's true, that we've polarized both sides of the aisle, so to speak, here, the media side and the White House side, and they are both have become so defensive and aggressive that that truth is a casualty.
Why do you think the president keeps going back to then? You know, if what you say is true, keeps going back to the New York Times, to the Washington Post, to these organizations that he calls not credible?
You know, that was a question I asked Kellyanne today, and I specifically referenced Maggie Haberman at the New York Times, and she tried to be diplomatic about this, because I said, you know, the president doesn't like Maggie Haberman, and she said no, that's not true, and I said, well, actually, he has said to me he doesn't like Maggie Haberman. And the truth is, I have no idea. Why would he single out a reporter who he does not like, who actually on a regular basis in front page stories makes fun of him? Matter of fact, her beat is sort of Donald Trump as the aberrant president, and yet there he is, calling her up and having her into the Oval Office. I think it must be that he wants the New York Times to like him.
Well, he's a New Yorker, and he thinks the New York Times, he knows the New York Times is credible. That's why there's really no other answer. Michael Wolff, always a pleasure. I'll see you here in New York soon, hopefully.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.